Thank you very much. I've been asked to fill in for Michael Paul Gallagher, so in the context of our welcoming panel, let's be conscious of Michael Paul, who's not well at the moment. I'd like to relate what I'm saying to Bob's paper that he's just given, particularly the issues of mistrust in institutions and the encounter theme. And the particular focus of my paper is on dialogue with what I'm calling skeptics. It's a broad concept which might include the indifference that Cardinal Ravasi spoke of during the first day. And it's coming out of a project I'm working on with atheist humanists to try and get a dialogue going that's more creative than just slinging insults at each other. I think this phenomenon of skepticism is very widespread in my part of the world. So I'm particularly coming from the northwestern European context. It might have more or less resonance with your parts of the world. So I'm conscious this is not a universal theory. It's located in a particular region with its own history and its own context. It seems to me there are two sources of this skepticism that I encounter in my part of the world. I come from England. I think Sister Helen, I could recognize a fellow traveler, comes from that part of the world. I think we have our own particular brand of the skeptics. They seem to come from two roots in my experience of this. One is the familiarity route, shall we say. I've heard that before, and it's not for me. And the second would be from the root of ignorance, of simply not knowing some of the very basics of the religious tradition in question. The familiarity route, it seems to me, has a sense of rejecting what it thinks it knows. Charles Taylor's spoken in his work of subtraction theories, people who've grown up accepting what's called the subtraction theory account, the notion that science has revealed the way forward. We don't need the overlay, the lacquer, the accretions of religion. We get through to the basic humanity, which has a clear message. That sort of subtraction theory account. And it often then leads to the sense of exclusive humanism, a form of atheism, as a default option certainly in my part of the world. And Charles has given a genealogy of that in his Secular Age, so we draw upon that. I think the other aspect is as well as the familiarity route, there's the route of ignorance. I think this isn't confined to the British context. I remember hearing one of the directors of the Louvre in Paris telling me about a crisis for art historians being sometimes you'll see a family in front of the nativity scene and one of the family will say, "Who's the baby?" And nobody in the family will know, it's just a baby. That anecdotal sense, I think, speaks of a lack of memory, a lack of transmission, of some of the very basics of the Christian message that I think is a growing phenomenon for people who've not had the basics of being church and so haven't rejected it. They've never really been faced with it in any serious way. I think that's a second route into the contemporary form of skepticism I'm talking about here. What I do in the paper, which I won't read, trying to do it in a more conversational sense, is look at three contemporary characteristics of both the context and the claims of skepticism, particularly skepticism towards the Christian faith, which is the one I'm particularly focusing on. What are those three claims, those three contexts? A first question of the context seems to me the new context is of a de facto pluralism which is unique in both its depth and its extent in history. I know Adriano will speak more of this in his paper, so I don't want to dwell too much on this. But I think this pluralism also has with it now, as Charles has also spoken of in his A Secular Age, a whole epistemic infrastructure to much of this pluralism, modes of justifying these options, as Hans Joas has developed in his work, which means the Christian tradition is faced by a whole range of options that are justified and present a new epistemic context for the acceptance and the propagation of the Christian faith. I think because of that de facto pluralism, the monopolistic hold of traditions, religious institutions, on salvation, in the eyes of these skeptics I'm talking to, has broken down. They don't believe any singular tradition is the one to provide the root of salvation in, I think, a different way to previous generations. I think Charles also talks of this in terms of cross pressures in his work, A Secular Age. And I think that is a distinctive change of the context of contemporary skepticism. So the question of de facto pluralism. The second factor of the context of skeptics, certainly in the northwestern world, certainly in Europe, is I think it's also defined as a post-Christian context now. I might say a post-Constantinian settlement. Peter Jonkers and Staff Hellemans are writing on this in terms of a Catholic minority church. The notion that churches, in my own context, the Anglican Church, which has been a majority, like the Catholic Church, is also becoming minority, and that will probably persist into the future. So the churches in the plural being minority communities within a broadly secular context, and a context within which skepticism is part of that secular context. I think in this aspect of a post-Christian context, the separation of the gospel and the culture is becoming embedded in all aspects of society, at the legal level, at the social structure level, rites of passage level, and so on, are becoming quite common, certainly in I think, the northwestern context. And in that context, I think the secularism and the skepticism of that is one of supersessionism. In other words, it's a view that the skepticism is a sort of stadial advance on what went before. It supersedes a less satisfactory option. I think that's a definite dimension of the self-understanding of skeptics, of seeing the Christian option as inadequate to the task of the present time. If that's the case, I think it is, it requires a new missionary outlook for the church and the church in its mission, which I think is something I find in Pope Francis's Evangelii Gaudium, the need for the church to take this new context of evangelization, of mission, seriously. A Chinese friend of mine said, mission sounds a bit militaristic, and it isn't the sense of that, I think, mission and evangelization I want to speak of. It's more a sense of the being sent. But the sense of which one is being sent is also a decentering of the one who is sent, because we also find God precedes us in that context. So it's not simply us being sent. I think the gospel has already been sent before we arrive. And the dialogue with skepticism and with skeptics, one of the challenges is to discover how it is speaking in that new and perhaps very foreign context, sometimes hostile context, if we can be open to that. A third point, I think, is the question in my own context of a denial that the Christian faith has an epistemic basis, that there's a justified basis to it. There are groups and vocal groups who consider religious belief to be an ungrounded claim. And they ground that, I think, in an exclusive humanist reading of the immanent frame, as Charles calls it, dependent on a reading of the scientific worldview where that type of evidence screens out the evidence of faith as being not knowledge, not a serious claim. That is a challenge in my context, I think, which is very highly developed in terms of scientific and technological articulacy. Sometimes the articulation of the faith is inadequate to meet that epistemic task. Those three contemporary characteristics of both the context and the claims of skepticism, I think, present a challenge to Christian dialogue with skepticism, because they often, in my experience, fail to see what the religious offer to them is. An open, welcoming church, rather than a sort of small sectarian core group, the open, very Catholic, welcoming style can seem to have nothing to offer to these people. And I think it is a challenge to develop a particular strategy to these skeptics, to propose concrete religious offers to them that they can recognize. One sub-question I think I have in this work of dialogue with skepticism is I'm not sure the framework of interreligious dialogue is adequate to frame the understanding of what it is to dialogue with skeptics. I don't think it is adequate for the reason that in interreligious dialogue there is a deepening of each other's faith in that. And there's an openness to transcendence in the dialogue, differently understood, of course, but very much the dialogue is framed in those terms. It seems to me in the dialogue with skeptics that these particular issues are screened out. It's not meant to be a deepening of faith or an opening to transcendence with skeptics. They're often indifferent to that. So I think using the category of interreligious dialogue with skeptics might be inadequate for this particular task, or at least this is something I'm trying as a heuristic in the particular work I'm doing at the moment. One of the reasons for that, perhaps, is the notion of a sort of self-enclosed personality that's developed, what Charles again calls the buffered self, of not letting people in, whether other points of view or the notion of transcendence. The closing off of the self, I think, is a feature of skepticism, and indeed for religious people too, but particularly I think with skepticism there is a closing to transcendence and to other points of view, which means the interreligious dialogue model struggles to make sense in that particular context. I conclude the paper as well with 3 points where I think there is an opportunity to move beyond what seems to me a given in dialogue with skeptics at the moment, which is that we all want to make a better world. The humanitarian project seems to me not really a problem. When I dialogue with skeptics, atheists, humanists, the problem is that it's reduced to that. In other words, they're very comfortable for us to build the community center together. And as Christians, we're very comfortable to do that. Where it's not comfortable is to dialogue about questions of meaning, deeper questions of depth and religious truth. That is often a priori screened out as unanswerable and not part of the objective of the dialogue. So some possible ways to try and open that search for meaning and truth in the dialogue with skeptics. 3 points. In my experience, one of the credibility conditions for entering the dialogue over meaning and truth, religious meaning and religious truth, is that there needs to be a homemade dimension, using the cooking analogy here. A lot of cooking programs at the moment in England. Anything that's ready-made, pre-packaged, that you haven't made yourself through struggle, through experience, through doubt, is considered not credible. In other words, the response from authority does not have credibility for these skeptics. Unless the person speaking has a genuine, personal, authentic experience of that which they speak, then the credibility of that claim is discounted in that dialogue, in my experience. I wonder whether that's an aspect of Rana's, the Christians of the future will be mystics. In other words, Christianity is for practitioners now in this part of the world, not for simply dogmatic assent, although that has its role clearly. I think a second focus in the dialogue would be the question of the death cafes. I must admit I haven't been to one yet. I'm just reading about. I will go to one though and tell you what it's like. These are cafes which have started. I think they started in London for people to talk about the taboo subject of death in a context where religious language is for the very few now in rites of passage such as death. People are creating spaces for people to talk about the experience of death, of all religious traditions and none. They're called death cafes. For me, I think one of the important aspects of that is that in dialogue with skeptics, a phenomenological approach, for me, importantly precedes any theological approach. A descriptive account of the experience of living with death of a loved one in family, one's own death, is a very important aspect in which questions of meaning and truth can be dealt with skeptics and people of religious traditions. It features in the Seekers question, I think, that many groups in the Disjunctions project have taken up. A final point, and this is the conclusion before the axe drops, is it seems to me, and this is what I think the project has tried to develop above the notion of a kenotic conception, a self-emptying conception of God, is an important corrective to a contradictory force field, I think, that was set up in modernity between omnipotence in the divine transcendent realm and human freedom. I think in many ways the trajectory of modern skepticism, or a significant trajectory, has traveled so well and has been lubricated by an inability to combinate omnipotence and human freedom. The notion that these are mutually exclusive, in my experience, plays in the experience of skeptics. It's because there is an omnipotent God that I don't believe because I want to be free. I think skeptics feel that. And I think this is something the kenotic God is trying to address. It's trying to address it, I think, in a way in which, one concrete example to finish, a friend of mine did a retreat recently on Buddhist and Ignatian spiritual traditions, and he asked me how he could do this with a group. He wasn't quite sure how he'd do it. He's used to 1 hour lecture rather than a whole day. And he chose the example of the phenomenology of bowing in religious traditions. The experience, the phenomenological account of bowing, or we call reverence, is subjection of the person to God. The experience of that is not one of disempowerment, it's one of liberation. And that's the actual concrete experience of bowing or of kneeling. That is read often by skeptics as subjection before a freedom-taking God. But the actual phenomenology of reverence has a very different tone to it, a very different flavor to it. It's very important in Islam too, of course, the subjection and so on. I think talking phenomenologically about the experience of this is very important because it puts people off in the context of omnipotence and freedom. The kenotic God to which we bow, in a way, bows back. And I think articulating that mutual kenotic movement opens up possibilities of dialogue with skeptics.